Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode is dedicated to Le'ila Nishmas Professor Jordan Penkower, a scholar of profound erudition and personal generosity. Yehi, zichro, baruch. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me svarimchatter@gmail.com, same email for Zelle, and you can find more information in the show notes below. You can also find the link to join the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community where I post new books, book deals, new Svarim, and so on. Also, you can find the link to join the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp status. And finally, if you can please subscribe to the podcast, whether you listen on 24/6, Apple, Spotify, Nucky, or wherever it is that you listen. And if you listen on Apple, if you can please rate the podcast. With that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. In this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Avinoam Stillman, who is a PhD candidate in the Free University in Berlin, and who his dissertation that he's working on is on Rabbi Meir Poppers. Rabbi Meir Poppers, or Papirush, as some listeners may see his name spelled, was one of the Talmidei of the Ari, very important in the dissemination of the Toras HaAriZal, Kabbalas Ari, and he wrote a number of Svarim and manuscripts himself. Avat Shalom now has recently been publishing a lot of them, and really a fascinating figure, maybe not so well known. And this is the opportunity on the podcast to talk a little bit about some Kabbalah, something that I haven't always done as much. I do want to say that a thank you, and this podcast is sponsored anonymously by a sponsor who wanted to say in honor of the birth of his son. He just had a baby. The sponsor was the one who reminded me, I think Avinoam, when we did a podcast a couple of years ago on Nathan of Gaza in the Shabbat Tzvi series, we mentioned this there, perhaps, I think so, because he got the sponsor reached out to me recently, said, "Are you going to do an episode on Rabbi?" And I was like, maybe. And he's like, "I'm going to sponsor it if you do it. You should go do it." So he really pushed me to do it, and we were able to work this out. You're in Lakewood, which is nice. So thank you for joining me once again.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I think let's first tell the listeners, you gave your biography and your background the last time, but tell listeners how you became interested in Rabbi Meir Poppers and this subject, and then we'll kind of talk about who he is. I guess we'll leave everyone in the dark a little bit, who he is, 17th century, but we'll get to him shortly. But how did you come to this subject?
Yeah, sure. I would say there's two answers. One is a product of what you get exposed to when you start trying to learn Kabbalah, and the other is the academic answer. So I'll give both answers. The first answer is for anybody who's begun to try to become interested in the writings of the Ari, Kitvei Ari, you will come across the name Rabbi Meir Poppers because he's most famous as the editor of what was for a very long time sort of the standard textbooks of Kabbalat Ari, particularly in Eastern Europe, but also in Eretz Yisrael and North Africa, and really around the Jewish world, which is the books that are known as Eitz Chaim, or more properly Derech Eitz Chaim, Pri Eitz Chaim, and Nof Eitz Chaim. So these are sort of the basic texts that people will study, and so you'll come across his name. He has this long introduction, Hakdama, to the Eitz Chaim, which is one of our guides to understanding how the Kitvei Ari came into being. So I came across his name. One of my dear teachers, Dr. Rabbi Menachem Kalus of Yerushalayim, who I had the great zchus and merit to learn with for quite a few years. You should live and be well. He's a big Meir Poppers fan, and he always turned me on to Rav Meir Poppers and his various writings, because not only did he edit the Eitz Chaim, but he wrote an important commentary on it. So you come across his name. The sort of academic answer, and the reason I wanted to write my PhD about him, there's this sort of overall one of these big questions that's impossible to answer, but we as historians, we look at the early modern period of Jewish history, and one of the distinctive characteristics is the spread of Kabbalah. And there's many factors in why Kabbalah spread, why this form of esoteric Jewish knowledge spread through printing, through different traditions and rituals, but really changed all of Jewish life. And the question of quote unquote how it happened on a small scale in historical detail, how did Kabbalah really come to play such a central role, is a question that we're still trying to unpack and untangle. And what I thought to myself is, what if I looked at one person and tried to see how he went from being a little kid to being a great Kabbalist? How does that even happen, right? What is the process of learning, and how did he both, as in his biography, learn this, very difficult body of knowledge, and then how did he spread it, and how did he contribute to bringing it to much wider audiences?
So let's tell the listeners about Rabbi Meir Poppers. When is he born? Where is he born? I'll say he's born in Krakow in Poland, and he ends up moving to Israel at a young age. So he's unique in that regard. But tell the listeners about him, his family, his zichros, where he's born, and how he ends up in Eretz Yisrael, and his background.
So Meir Poppers is born in 1628 in Krakow, as you said. I mean, technically in Kazimierz, the Jewish quarter of Krakow. And he's born into an extremely wealthy family. His grandfather was named Wolf Bocian Poppers, who was one of the most wealthy Jews of Krakow in the 17th century. You know you're rich when you're named in anti-Semitic treatises. He shows up as one of the richest Jews of Krakow in a Polish anti-Jewish book. And we know a fair amount about him. There's a large section of a chapter on him in Meir Balaban's classic History of the Jews of Krakow, which exists in both Polish and Hebrew, unfortunately not in English. So he's in the elite, but really the economic elite, not so much the rabbinic elite, although at the time, there's a lot of overlap. Certainly in Ashkenazi communities, there's those who are rich and those who are learned. There's a lot of overlap there. His father, Yehuda Leib Poppers, he refers to constantly as Hanadiv, the generous, right? The philanthropist, I would say. And his father played an important role in the Krakow community. He shows up in the Pinkas Krakow in a few places for different charitable things, different takanot, communal regulations that he's involved in formulating or enforcing. So he's in a prominent family. His mother's name is Chana. We don't Chava rather. In Balaban it says Chana, but I went back to the original archival documents in Krakow. It says Chava, so we don't know much about her. But he grows up in Krakow, and just to give a sense for those who are aware a little bit of the rabbinic history of Krakow, this is a generation after, or 2 generations after, the mid-16th century flourishing of Krakow with Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, of course, being the most famous as a halachic authority, but also as a philosopher. Right? Underrated. The Ramah wrote a book called Toras HaAriZal, which is, a massive treatment of Jewish philosophy combined with Kabbalah. And the Poppers grows up at the period of Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, the Bach, the Beit Chadash, who's also, again, one of these people who combines halacha and Kabbalah, right? Obviously, majorly famous for writing Kabbalah, halachic commentaries, and a lot of responsa, very important responsa, but at the same time, somebody who we know was interested in Kabbalah and wrote comments on the writings of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero in manuscript, and also on early writings of the Ari. And this brings me really to this point that the moment that Poppers grows up in the sort of, second quarter of the 17th century is one in which new Kabbalistic knowledge from Tzvat is becoming more and more part of what people are interested in learning in Ashkenaz, in the Ashkenazi world. And so he grows up in a context in which there are increasingly people studying the writings of the Ari as they had made it to them, but it's really piecemeal. It's not there. We'll talk about this in a moment. There's a large body of writings that make up the Kitvei Ari. It's only very particular texts that don't represent, so to speak, the full picture that make it to Krakow. And I would say that in my view, one of the things that's key about Poppers is he's a curious kid. He must be exposed to Kabbalah Ta'ari. He's heard the name Isaac Luria. He's heard the miracle stories. All these, there are letters being sent in order to raise money by the Jews living in Tzvat, who send letters to people in Poland to try to raise money. There's word on the street is that there's a new form of Kabbalah, a new form of of wisdom, and he's very intrigued by that. But at the earliest stage, not much is available of the full set of Kitvei Ari as we know it today.
So another thing to clarify that I mentioned earlier, his name is Rabbi Meir Poppers, but it's spelled Pei Aleph Pei Yud Resh Shin. So, but people think it's Papirosh. It's not. It's Poppers.
Right. It's similar to the name Isserlis, right, which is Isserols, right, belonging to, right, the son of Isser. In the same way, Popper was the family name, and so he's Poppers because he belongs to that family. When you go into the manuscripts, as we'll talk about, he moves to Jerusalem, and so a lot of his reception was in the Sephardi world. They don't know what to do with this name, so it becomes Papirosh, it becomes Popil. Maybe they had trouble reading the Ashkenazi handwriting, I don't know, but it takes a lot of different forms.
Yeah, and he's unique in that regard. I mean, obviously the Arizal is from a Ashkenazi background. Rabbi Meir Poppers is an Ashkenazi that ends up in that Sephardi world in Yerushalayim. So how does he, like you said, he comes from an influential, wealthy family, but he picks up at age 13 and he moves to Eretz Yisrael. Do we know why, how, he's young? What happens there?
So we only know what he says himself, which is in this introduction to Eitz Chaim, which I mentioned above. He says, from the time I was 13, I had a fire burning in my bones to learn Kabbalah, and he somehow knew that the place to do that was Eretz Yisrael. There are other bits and pieces of his writings where he hints to the fact that he was initially very interested in philosophy. He talks about studying, or at least mentions Plato and Aristotle, Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina. That may not be that he literally read them, but he heard of them. He was interested in philosophy. And at some point he became disillusioned with sort of rationalist philosophy and became fascinated by Kabbalah. And I think it's a natural choice because at the time, the students of the Ari had passed away in the previous generation. Rav Chaim Vital, the most important student of the Ari, dies in 1620, but the students of the students are still around. And, Meir Poppers is not the first Ashkenazi to go to Eretz Yisrael to learn Kabbalah. We have Reb Shlomo Mainstral of Dresnitz, who wrote the famous letters which became the core of what we call Shivchei HaAri. You can see on this at length. You may not agree with all the conclusions, but at length in Meir Ben Aya's Toldot HaAri and in several other sources as well. We have, of course, the Shla Kadosh, right? Rabbi Yeshayahu Horowitz, who at an older age moves from Prague, after being rabbi all over the place, moves to Tzfat and Yerushalayim, in order to learn Kabbalah substantially. So what makes Meir Poppers different is not that he went to Eretz Yisrael to learn Kabbalah, it's that he went at the age of 13, right? Most of the time, most of the other examples we have are of elderly scholars who have already spent a lifetime learning, and by the end of their lives, like many pious Jews, they want to live the end of their lives and be buried in Eretz Yisrael. And that's, fairly common. And to combine that with an interest in Kabbalah is also fairly common. The difference is Poppers goes at an extremely young age. He ends up marrying a Sephardi woman. He ends up learning how to write in Sephardi script. He ends up learning some Ladino or Judesmo. He here and there will use words. He knows Yiddish from growing up, but he learns this other language too. And so he's a fusion of Ashkenazi and Sephardi cultures. He's a hybrid personality in a way that's not true. Like the Shla, he gets to Damascus and he wants to read the writings of Rav Chaim Vital, and he complains, I can't read it because it's in Sephardi handwriting and it's too difficult for me. Whereas Poppers can write in Sephardi handwriting. So it's a totally different, because of the age at which he moves, it's a totally different experience and has a totally different result.
Do we know who his teachers were when he's in Poland and when he goes there? Because he's still young when he goes to Israel. Who his teachers are there?
He doesn't really mention his teachers in Poland. Once he mentions a teacher named Rabbi Yisrael, who I believe is Rabbi Yisrael Gantz, who wrote a sefer on Birkat HaMazon, which is lost, but is quoted substantially in Rav Chaim Buchner's Totzot Chaim, I think it's called. It has Chaim in it. It's a commentary on on Birkat HaMazon, on benching, on different rules around eating. But he doesn't really mention, and I assume that he was sort of an autodidact, but was also, probably had private teachers the way that, the children of wealthy families would have. When he gets to Eretz Yisrael, he starts learning. He mentions a teacher named Rabbi Yisrael Ashkenazi, who's not such a well-known rabbi, Rabbi Yisrael ben Yechiel, Luria Ashkenazi, no direct relation to the Ari. But his main teacher initially is somebody named Rabbi Yisrael Binyamin. Rabbi Yisrael Binyamin is a very important rabbi of the period. He's based originally in Alexandria. He's an Egyptian Rav. He moves to Eretz Yisrael. He becomes the head of the Beit Din in Yerushalayim. And he himself was a student of Rabbi Yosef ibn Tabul, who was, I would say, the second most important student of the Ari. So we have Rav Chaim Vital, who's without a doubt the most important student, at least on the basis of the quality and quantity of what he wrote. He wrote far more than the other students, so that already, gives him pride of place. But Rabbi Yosef ibn Tabul, who's originally a North African, he's called Hamaravi or a Maghrebi. He is a very important teacher as well, particularly in Egypt. And so when Poppers starts learning with Rabbi Yisrael Binyamin, he's already been exposed to the writings of Chaim Vital, and he sees those texts, but he also gets direct access to somebody who was a direct student of one of the Ari's students. So he has a direct line going back to the Ari himself in Tzfat. And the other person I'll mention is Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach, without a doubt his most important teacher. I'll say more about this in a moment, but a very fascinating character whose Beit Midrash he joins when living in Yerushalayim.
Yeah, I think we should go there. And I will mention, so as you say, he's born in Poland, travels when he's 13 to Eretz Yisrael. We know he lives there for a while. He goes back to Poland. Then he goes back to Israel, I get confused how many times he's going back and forth, but he goes back and forth a bunch of times, and we can talk more of that later. But when he's in Eretz Yisrael, at least in the beginning, and he, like you said, he had an interest in Kabbalah, he goes to Eretz Yisrael, he's learning Kabbalah, he gets involved with all these Kabbalistic rebbeim, and he's involved, as you mentioned, with Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach. You can talk more about Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach, very important as well, with the Toras HaAriZal, Kisvei Ari, Kabbalah Ari, all of the above. So what's his involvement there, and then how does that play itself out with Rabbi Meir Poppers?
So he manages to come at a really wonderful time. He has very good timing. When he arrives in Yerushalayim, it's around 1641. And shortly afterwards, there's a sort of revelation of a large group of manuscripts. So really, al regel achat, right on one foot, just to overview the way the writings of the Ari played out through history. The Ari himself wrote very little, although he did write some things, mainly a commentary on the section of the Zohar known as the Sifra D'Tzneuta, but very minimal. So the majority of the writings of the Ari that we have are written by his students, mainly by Chaim Vital, also by Yosef ibn Tabul, who I just mentioned, also by Moshe Yonah, other important students. But essentially, what makes Rav Chaim Vital special is that he kept trying over and over to get it right, in the sense that he rewrote different mahadurot, different versions of the text. And a lot of this, I will say, we know mainly from Meir Poppers himself, who describes this process. Vital wrote, even during the lifetime of the Ari, already wrote down what he heard from the Ari as the Ari taught classes, mainly about the Zohar, in various places in and around Tzfat. And then after the Ari died, he spent years rewriting. Now, he lived in Tzfat until the 1590s, and before he left Tzfat, he was in Jerusalem briefly, but before he left Tzfat, he left a large set of his manuscripts in the Geniza of Tzfat. And we have evidence from various sources that there was a Geniza in the cemetery of Tzfat. He leaves these texts not because he thinks they're wrong, but because, and this is my best guess, this is a controversial issue among scholars, but my assessment of the situation is that he's already started writing what we call the book Eitz Chaim, or Shmona Sha'arim, which is a 8-volume sort of final authorized version of the writings of the Ari. That was recently published by Ahavat Shalom for the very first time from Rav Chaim Vital's own manuscripts. It's an amazing work, but there are all these intermediary drafts as he kept trying to get it right. And so he leaves those drafts in the Geniza. Then he moves to Damascus, and he keeps this 8-volume set very close to him, and he doesn't allow people to see it. So even though it's written, it's not circulating. It hasn't been published, right? We think about publishing as something that only happens in print, but there is such a thing as manuscript publication. When you release a manuscript for other people to copy and study, that's a form of publication. He does not allow that to happen. And so what happens is at some point, and it's unclear how this happens exactly, somebody extracts his manuscripts from the Geniza in Tzfat and begins to circulate them. And Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach comes into the picture just at this moment. He's preceded by another Kabbalist, Rabbi Avraham Azulai, very important North African Kabbalist, but I'll bracket his role for a moment. Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach is a fascinating character. Just in short, he grew up in Portugal as a Christian, and already as an adult, he leaves his life as a converso and moves to Saloniki, where he returns to Judaism and begins studying. Clearly a very brilliant person. He then moves to Damascus. He's in Tzfat and eventually settles in Yerushalayim. His life goal is to turn these, this pile of messy manuscripts that was pulled out of a hole in the ground in the cemetery in Tzfat and turn them into readable books. And he doesn't do this alone. He does this as part of a team. So much like today when there are research projects, and people bring in lots of different, grad students, such as myself, to do work for a larger project. So he does that as well. He and Rabbi Yitzchak Gaon, who's an important communal leader in Yerushalayim, Sephardi Parnas, they create a private Beit Midrash, in which they call a midrash, which is really an old Sephardi model of a private, institute of advanced study. And they together copy these texts. And Meir Poppers is one of the scribes, one of the sofrim, who copies these texts and learns them in the context of this Beit Midrash. And so there's, it's like there's often sometimes in music, there'll be like a record that was recorded in the 60s and never released, and it's sat in a vault somewhere. And then suddenly it's, put out in the world and you hear an entirely different side of some musician, right? It's similar to that. It's that there was a time capsule because of the Geniza, and then it, came public exactly when Rav Meir Poppers gets there, and he really takes advantage of that. And he comes in at a stage when Rav Yaakov Tzemach had already completed editing the first round of books. So books that we know of as Otzrot Chaim, Adam Yashar, Kilat Yaakov, and some others, Zohar Rakia. He's already done the first round of editing. And now Rav Yaakov Tzemach decides to create an anthology where he puts together passages that are on similar topics so that it's more of a comprehensive read, right? Instead of reading one book and then reading another book that covers some of the same material, but in a slightly different way, it's all sort of integrated. And he starts to do that. And Rav Meir Poppers picks up where he leaves off in his work, Derech Eitz Chaim, by combining this, what's called the Mahadura HaGnuza, right? The hidden edition, by combining it with the first drafts of Chaim Vital's writings that had been circulating prior for many, for more decades prior. Those are the works known as Drushim, Kavanot, Likutim in various manuscript versions. And he integrates those and also material from other students of the Ari. So the famous Kanfei Yonah of Rabbi Moshe Yonah becomes in his book Shar HaKlalim, the first sort of introductory overview of Lurianic Kabbalah, or various sections of Rabbi Yosef ibn Tabul, who's writing on, for example, the correct kavanot to have one shaking the lulav, right? So different texts that are integrated from the other students of the area as well. But at this stage, Meir Poppers is working as an anthologist. He's not doing that much original writing. He's mostly collecting and editing together, which is itself, a very complex operation, but he's not yet so much of an independent thinker. So
when we talk about his role at this point, do we mean, as you're saying, he's a copyist, so he's taking the manuscripts and he's copying it over? While he's doing that, is he just a scribe, just literally the manual labor, or he's doing editing? And then, like you said, when he's creating the anthology, is he working under Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach? As Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach is the general editor and he's the editor, so Meir Poppers is actually selecting what to pick and what not to, but then Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach is his boss that he goes to and says, hey, what do you agree with this or not agree with this? What is that? Do we know what that process actually looks like while they're creating these anthologies and copying and editing these various texts?
I don't think it's as straightforward as he's his boss. However, there are a few times in his writings where he'll say, I asked Rav Yaakov Tzemach what he thought, and he said, oh yeah, that's a good idea, or whatever. But there's not, some of it's, you get the impression that it's sort of an independent project. Part of it is that he wants to create something similar to what Rav Chaim Vital did as a final edition. So he's trying to sort of retrofit the text that he has to the model of Rav Chaim Vital's own writings, based on what he knows about Rav Chaim Vital's writings. Certainly, he takes a lot of inspiration from Rav Yaakov Tzemach, but it's not like a pure apprenticeship. I think he's doing it for his own reasons. And, what happens basically is he creates a first draft of this anthology of the Eitz Chaim. I'm just going to call it the Eitz Chaim, even though there are other texts that are called that, Derech Eitz Chaim, technically. He creates a first draft, and then it's 1649. He's in Yerushalayim, and a variety of factors cause him to leave. There seems to have been a plague in the town, which is a fairly common occurrence at the time and today. And so he leaves to get away from the plague. There's also probably a connection to the sort of financial troubles. His father seems to have died in the meantime, and he was definitely relying on family support in order to live in Yerushalayim. And so he probably needs to go back also for financial reasons. And it's also after the Khmelnytsky uprisings of 1648, right, Tach V'Tat. And so there's definitely an overall sense of crisis among the Ashkenazim in Eretz Yisrael. And so he moves and he takes this first draft of the text with him. And this is really one of the first times, if not the first time, that the writings of Chaim Vital are being taken out of Eretz Yisrael. There was a sort of impromptu, unofficial, unclear sort of cherem or ban against taking the writings of Rav Chaim Vital out of Eretz Yisrael. And he breaks that ban. For his own reasons. He goes first to Damascus, where he learns briefly with Rav Shmuel Vital. He says he's there for 8 days. He looks at Rav Chaim Vital's own manuscripts, and then he keeps moving. He gets to Kushta, Constantinople, Istanbul, and he finishes the text. So he's sort of signing off. He's finishing the text around there. And then he moves, on a sort of standard trade route. He's moving from Constantinople back to Krakow. And so by 1650, we find him in Krakow, and we have a whole bunch of manuscripts with his own autograph handwriting from Krakow. We have some also earlier from Eretz Yisrael as well. So it's sort of a remarkable amount of autograph manuscript material. It's what makes it so interesting to study. You really get to see his own handiwork. And when he gets to Krakow, he starts working with a group of Sofrim, the most important of whom is named Rav Kopel Sofer, who copied text, beautiful, beautiful Polish Ashkenazi handwriting. And they worked together to create the first sort of monumental copies of Derech Eitz Chaim, Pri Eitz Chaim, Nof Eitz Chaim. The first edition, the first volume, Derech Eitz Chaim, does not exist anymore as far as we know. Maybe it's in someone's attic somewhere, but the Pri Eitz Chaim is currently, that Poppers himself copied, is currently in the National Library in Israel. And the Nof Eitz Chaim is in a private collection, but has been seen by scholars. And so we have sort of a window into his manuscript production, this is, I call him sometimes the Johnny Appleseed of Kabbalah. Like, he comes to Poland with these texts that had never been there before, and he just drops them, and he knows they're going to be copied. I was just in Oxford for 10 days, and I found a manuscript that was exactly copied from the Pri Etz Chaim that's now in Jerusalem, and you can tell even the page layout. It's all the same, and they even integrate Poppers' own notes on the side into the body of the text. You can see how he knew where to plant and publish these texts in manuscript, right? He never published them in print. They never go to print until the end of the 18th century. They're not printed until Koretz 1782. But they spread in manuscript like wildfire, and they're all around the Jewish world, all around Ashkenaz, into Italy. And certainly in Eretz Yisrael. He eventually goes back and continues to work on his own writings. He's in Lvov briefly, Lemberg. He goes back to Kushta, to Constantinople. Eventually, he makes it back to Eretz Yisrael, and that's where he dies at the very young age. He's 34. It's 1662, shortly before the whole Shabtai Tzvi debacle unfolds. But in a very short lifetime, he manages to transform entirely the world of Kabbalah, of what is available where.
So some interesting notes. First of all, you mentioned that he stops in Damascus and he learns with Shmuel Vital. That's Reb Chaim Vital's son. And another, the best analogy I can give, you keep saying manuscript culture, and this is an important part of it. And even after print, this has been studied, and you can read about this in many places, there's still manuscript culture. It's still copied, even in the age of print. But the best analogy today is someone sharing a Word document. It happens all the time. Hey, I wrote this article. Here you go. Take my Word document, and don't share it, or yes, share it. And it gets all over the internet today. Everything's shared on WhatsApp, right? And everything gets all over. And suddenly, you it's not published anywhere, but, you can read and check it out there. We even have, not an extent, people have dissertations, not published. It's like, read that. That's more like somewhat published in between. But anyways, he has these things that are published. And like you said, he means them to be copied. He means them to circulate in manuscript, but they're not printed. Sometimes these things aren't printed for lack of money, funds, editing, other reasons for whatever. They didn't want to print it for whatever reason. But interestingly, his stuff, like you said, moves around, and he dies, unfortunately, at 34. But he is, very important. And you mentioned Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach, is one of his Rebbeim. And what is Rabbi Meir Poppers' role? You've mentioned some of his role, but how important is he in the dissemination of the Toras HaAriZal? Is it because he goes to Poland and he's really spreading it out through, Ashkenazi lands? Is that his most important? It's also his anthologies and his dissemination otherwise. It's not only is that the most key part of Poland, or is it other parts as well?
There are two sides of it, at least two sides of it. One is simply these texts, if you want to learn Kabbalah Ta'ari seriously, you need to read the writings of Reb Chaim Vital. There's no other real option. There are texts that are, cover some of the same territory, like the various writings that were circulating. I don't want to go into the weeds too much, but various writings that were circulating in Poland, you could read and get a sense of what Kabbalah Ta'ari is about. But if you actually want to understand, not only to understand conceptually, but in a practical sense, right? If you want to, for example, daven, pray with the kavanot, pray with the set of meditations that the Ari prescribes, you have to, it's very difficult to imagine how one could do that without the writings of Reb Chaim Vital. So on a sort of substantive level, Meir Poppers brings these texts. Now, some of them began to circulate through other ways. I'm not saying it wouldn't have happened without him, but he sped up the process, and he brought it in a accessible package to people in a way that would not have happened otherwise. So there's sort of the substantive thing of like, how did he, what were the texts that he brought? He also really edited it in an accessible way by dividing into 3 volumes. And in this, he claims he's following Reb Chaim Vital's own scheme. There's a theoretical basis in Derech Eitz Chaim, a practical application in Pri Etz Chaim, because that's about mitzvot and about prayers and about kavanot. And then in the last section, Nof Etz Chaim, sort of an overview of different other teachings of the Ari, interpretations of Tanakh, of rabbinic literature, of the Zohar, and of course also the whole topic of Gilgul and reincarnation, transmigration of souls. These are all key topics that come in the 3rd volume. The other thing is that as a personality, Poppers seems to have been very committed to teaching. And he cultivates students who go around, and we don't know as much about this as it would be nice to know, but we know, for example, that one of his relatives is a guy named Rabbi Yosef ben Shlomo Hadarshan, the preacher of Poznan, of Posen. And so he teaches him Kabbalah in Krakow, and then Rabbi Yosef Hadarshan goes back to Posen and teaches Kabbalah in his sermons, right? So it's not just the text, it's his influence as a teacher also funnels through, and disseminates throughout the culture.
Yeah, to read from the Chida in Shem HaGdolim, Rabbi Chaim Vital says, therefore writes a Lilmud B'Sfarim HaYosrim M'Diyakim, someone who wants to read the precise text of Toras of the Ari, Yom HaShmayna Sha'arim Shasidim Marash, he should read the Shmayna Sha'arim, Shmuel Vital, V'derech Eitz HaChaim Shasidim Aram Poppers. Hanikrid Eitz Chaim Shaboya Madura Bas. So he's saying that's what you should be reading in Rabbi Meir Poppers. So he's obviously given the, he does famous. People are familiar.
And I want to take the opportunity to sort of correct the record. There's a impression that some of the scholarship gives that Rabbi Meir Poppers sort of edited heavily the text. I don't think, from my experience, spending now quite a while reading through this material, his intervention on a micro level in the text is very small. Maybe a few words of introduction. He'll smooth over some language transitions, but he's very minimal and very respectful of the text. His genius is on the level of fitting together different larger sections in a way that makes it readable, and putting the chapters together. But on the level of the word and the sentence, he is not doing much to tamper with the writings of Rav Chaim Vital, which, again, he was copying directly from Rav Chaim Vital's own autographs, right? So there's not that much scribal distance between him and the source.
So another thing to mention is Rabbi Meir Poppers' own works. Now, we've mentioned Derech Eitz Chaim, Pri Eitz Chaim, Neuf Eitz Chaim, the works of the Ari, but he has his own works as well, and these are what Avat Shalom has been printing now, and there's other editions. I have a different edition here, Ar Tzadikim, that came out a couple years ago. There's Ar Tzadikim, Ar Yashar, the name changes of the book, but there's Ma'arei Ar, there's Tal Iris on Chumash, there's Ar Zarua, Ar Shabbos, Torah, just goes on, Ar Bohir, Ar Rav. There's a lot of books. You can read this one has a whole, this in the beginning of this Ar Tzadikim has a whole list of all the Svarim. So what about his own Svarim? And again, as you said, we're not printed in his lifetime, so they're published after his lifetime.
Right, and some of these were circulating in manuscript. Some of them were published afterwards. Avat Shalom has printed some texts that have never been printed before, Kedarkam Bakodesh. If Rav Meir Poppers had only edited the Derech Eitz Chaim, Pri Eitz Chaim, Nov Eitz Chaim, Dayenu, right, it would have been enough. He would have made his name as one of the most important conduits of the teachings of the Ari. What makes him so special to me is that he's really, I would say aspaklaria ha'meira. He's a shining mirror that reflects all of the different genres of Kabbalistic writing and literature in the period. So he manages in a very short life to contribute classic works to almost every genre of Kabbalah. So we talked about his editing of the writings of the Ari, but he has commentaries on the writings of the Ari, both a full commentary or almost full commentary called Or Zarua on the Eitz Chaim, notes on the Pri Eitz Chaim. He has commentary on the Ari's own poems, the famous poems that we say on Shabbat, Askinu Sudasa, these Aramaic poems, B'nai Hechala, for Shalashudis, classic poems. He has the Or Tzadikim, which is his Musar manual, right? It's a guide. He says explicitly he was asked by his students in Poland, how do we behave in a way in line with the Chassidut, right? The piety of Lurianic Kabbalah, and he gives them a guidebook, from the moment you wake up in the morning to the moment you go to sleep at night, including your dreams, everything else, a guidebook for how to live your life. And it's a fascinating book, very accessible for those who are interested in a taste of what living a Kabbalistic lifestyle looks like. Great book. He writes his own drashot, right? So his book Talorot, which was published, which are a series of, there's some Kabbalah in there, but for the most part, it's just classic homiletical drashot on the Parsha. He writes a commentary on earlier Kabbalistic texts. So that includes, obviously, the Zohar. He has a massive commentary, or Rav, on the Zohar. But in addition, he comments on less well-known Kabbalistic texts. He has a commentary on the Bahir, right? The Sefer HaBahir, one of the earliest of Kabbalistic texts, if not the earliest. He also has a super commentary, phrase I always like, a super commentary on the commentary of the Ramban, right? Nachmanides' commentary on the Torah, in which he explains the Kabbalistic secrets in Nachmanides according to the teachings of the Ari. At times, he even sides with the Ramban against the Ari. He was a very independent thinker in that way. He has a book, also notes, this exists in manuscript, his notes on the Torah commentary of Rabbi Menachem Rekanati, one of the earliest texts that he wrote when he was still probably 14 years old in Jerusalem. He's already writing notes in the margins of that book. He has his own siddur, or Pnei Melech, siddur currently in a private collection, but this siddur is without a doubt the basis of the Sidur Ha'ari, the Lurianic prayer book that became popular throughout Eastern Europe. It exists in many, many tens of copies in manuscript, eventually is printed in multiple editions, and is a direct, predecessor of the famous, Nusach Sfard, quote-unquote, Hasidic prayer book, or, when Chabad says they have Nusach Ha'ari, right, they're basing themselves on this sort of siddur that he brought. He apparently had a commentary on the Ein Yaakov, right, on the Agadita, the non-halachic passages in the Talmud. He has a book called Or HaAvuka, which is a sort of dialogue that exists, amazingly enough, in the Cairo Geniza. They found 1 or 2 pages of this text in which he deals with theological issues, things like, is God, is infinite? Is the world part of God, or is the world separate from God? This question of pantheism, right? Very classic theological question. And he deals with it. He presumably dealt with all sorts of other things as well. Unfortunately, that which may have been his most sort of advanced and original work is mostly lost, very disappointingly. But the list goes on. And it's really remarkable to think that somebody at such a young age, he wrote also one of the earliest and most important Ilanot, right? So there's this, the classic already, it just came out this year. It is already a classic book of Yossi Chayes, The Kabbalistic Tree, which deals extensively with Meir Poppers' Ilan, the Poppers' Ilan, which is, a unique depiction of Adam Kadmon, of the first, emanation in the system of the Ari, and it's something that he apparently drew for the sake of his students in Poland. So the list really, this wasn't even all the books, right? It's jaw dropping.
Yeah, there's so many works. Most of them have the word "or" in them. I'm looking. So there was a Ar Tzadikim that was published a few years ago in Tafshin Pei, a really beautiful edition with a full commentary on the bottom. Notes. It's very, very nice. They compare the different editions because I think we said there was Ar Tzadikim was printed, then they printed Ar Yashar, things were added, and then it's back to Ar Tzadikim. So this one is really nice to compare the editions. There's a whole introduction. They have a long list of all the Sfarim in the beginning, and as you said, a lot of them were printed the first time by Avat Shalom, which is the Ar Zarua, Ar Shabbos, I think, or a bunch of them were printed for the first time by Avat Shalom. So there's those, you can get those. And I think in the Tal Eris is where they put the bio. Also, there is a bio in the Minag Nozim, the Avat Shalom journal in volume 14. there's Moshe Hillel, Yaakov Hillel's son, wrote a piece of it's kind of a bio, talks about the writings, and I know you're thanked in there. He thanks you in there in the note. So that's pretty lengthy, and I don't know if it's the same or different in the Tal HaAriZal, I believe, but you can read about him, or in the introduction to this, or Tzadikim as well. I mean, so listen, like you said, he was 34 years old. He wrote all these works. There's so many Sfarim that we have and we don't have, and that are being printed today, more and more. And so, he's important in so many different ways. Where his own books that you can get, or the other one. So, what just to say, what you would tell the listeners, someone that just the most accessible would be Art Tzadikim or Tal HaAriZal. What would be the most accessible for somebody interested in his writings?
I think if you don't have a background in the Kabbalah Ta'ari, which is 99% of the people on this planet, most of his texts are fairly dense. You might find moments where you can understand it, but a lot of it is pretty technical Kabbalistic writing. Or Tzadikim is not technical. Some of it's very down to earth, like don't cheat, pay your bills on time, like standard Musar, good advice about how to be a human in the world. So Or Tzadikim is a great place to start. I would say also, like you said, the text called Talorot, which is his drashot. They're very beautiful drashot, and if you want to just read that's very accessible. I would say if you're interested in the story of the writing of the history of Kabbalah Ta'ari, but not necessarily equipped to get into the nitty-gritty of the details, his introduction to Eitz Chaim is extremely worth reading because it lays out parts of his own biography and also his sense of how the writings of the Ari spread. So that's a very important text. I will say I forgot to mention another very important text of his called Me'orei Or, which is a lexicon, which can be interesting just as a sense of how to learn. It's a list of words and what they mean in Kabbalah language, right? So like Levana, right? The moon, what does that actually mean? Okay, it refers to the Shekhinah, right? Things of that nature. That was a simplified example. I will say also, just because you mentioned Rav Moshe Hillel, there's a saying I've heard in academia, or in general, when people are working on a biography, it often is an autobiography in some ways. Katonti, obviously I'm no Meir Poppers here, but I do feel that there's some sort of hashgacha, providential guidance that, like Poppers, I'm an Ashkenazi. I moved to Yerushalayim. I lived there. Then I went back, currently living in Berlin. But I've learned a lot from the great Sephardi Mekubalim and scholars in Jerusalem. And Moshe Hillel is, of course, one of them. And I feel lucky that when I started working on this project, this article had not yet come out. Now I can reference it, and it's made my life a lot easier. And his, scholarship is so precious. And so I feel lucky to have had sort of a long-distance chavruta on Rabbi Meir Poppers over the past few years with Reb Moshe.
And so just to mention one more thing about Art Tzadikim for the listeners, so it's like a daily manual. So in the beginning, Zman Hashkamas Adam HaBoker, when you wake up, putting Levishas Begadim, going to the bathroom, Detilas Yadayim, Kavan, Hilchas Tzitzis, putting on Tefillin, davening, Kriya Shema, Shemona Esrei, etc., Hilchas Suda, etc. You work, on, and he goes through Hilchas Shabbos, Kabbalah Shabbos, Yom Tov, Rosh Chodesh, Tainis, Saras Mechuvim. It's a yearly manual. You have a lot of these type of svarim that
Right, and he organizes it. He says it's organized roughly according to the order of the Shulchan Aruch. And he says in the introduction, very interestingly, he says, I'm aware that there's some discrepancies between what standard halacha says and what the Kabbalah says, and I'm here to just represent the Kabbalistic side, and you can work your way through and choose. But I think that's really probably the best text just to get an overview.
Another thing to talk about so there's that one, and like I said, there's that I don't know what to call it, the Tufshin Pei edition, but it has a commentary called Me'orei Or. Oddly enough, but that's a nice one. There's an Ora Yasher that you can get. There's also, I know, Avat Shalom's included. So Avat Shalom is really like the really nice editions, and they really did work with the manuscript. The only reason I reference that other one is that it has like a real commentary in the bottom and notes. It's much more extensive than what Avinoam has. So if someone wants to have those, modern full, notes, explanatory notes, that would be the one. But otherwise, Avinoam's really done a lot of work on a lot of his writings now.
Yeah, so most of what they published is actually in one manuscript that's held in the National Library. And it's remarkable because it was his private manuscript that he wrote himself. And he writes it going back and forth between Ashkenazi handwriting and Sephardi handwriting, or what I would call Ottoman Sephardi handwriting, because it's a little bit of a later period after the expulsion. And, that's where a lot of these texts were that didn't exist and don't exist anywhere else. I've gone through and compared the manuscript, not the whole thing, but when I'm working on a particular section, it's the manuscript's available like so many other things on the National Library Ktiv portal. Avinoam does an incredible job. I'm not going to say I've never found a discrepancy between what's written in the manuscript and what they have, but if, for those who are not looking to work on early modern Hebrew paleography, it's the way to go.
In Or Tzadikim, to be clear, we don't have the manuscript anymore?
Right. So basically what happened, Or Tzadikim was published in 1697, if I remember correctly, in Frankfurt Oder, which is a city actually east of Berlin, so not to be confused with Frankfurt Main. Had a very early Hebrew printing press, very interesting place because there was a very important university there, actually. No, actually Hamburg. Hamburg,
Yeah,
1690. I'm taking it back.
That was written in Hamburg.
Hamburg, 1690. Excuse me. I'm thinking of Yesod Yosef, which was a book published by Poppers' cousin.
And that mentions him.
That on the front cover it says, Meir Poppers Yerushalmi, taught me Kabbalah in Krakow. So
that book's been redone actually recently.
Yeah, that's a book about Tikkun Habrit. Very interesting book that I've written a little bit about. But the Or Tzadikim Hamburg 1690 was published by somebody named Yehuda Leib, who doesn't tell us that much about it, what he got up to, but he published sort of a minimal version. He seems to have left some stuff out, but I don't think he added anything either. It's sort of a pamphlet. A few years later, in Amsterdam, they published an edition that claimed to fill out what was missing, but I would venture to say that they added a little bit more than what Rabbi Meir Poppers himself wrote, and that came under the title Or HaYashar. And so that text has more going on than the Or Tzadikim. And then there was another edition published in Warsaw that claimed to be based on a manuscript. We do not have any manuscript of this text, so what we have are 3 different editions, all slightly different. Presumably, every later edition relied on the earlier editions in addition to whatever else they had. Personally, I tend to go to the Hamburg 1690, which is also available online, and that was the basis of Avinoam's edition, mainly because, the less is more. Right, I want to be sure that I'm reading Rabbi Meir Poppers' words from an academic point of view. If you're just interested in sort of reading a good Musar book, then Or HaYashar is also wonderful.
Yeah, it's interesting. The one in Tafshin Pei, they say that, and it's just called Madur Zichro Yehuda, the one with Maria, they say that they mentioned that the Warsaw one says they based on manuscript, and they go, well, it's worth pointing out that it seems like they maybe added some stuff from Yashar or Yashar. Like they mentioned the question, but they still base their edition on the Warsaw one because, he said he used the manuscript. So they even though they note the discrepancy and they compare the edition. So that's just worth pointing out. So one other thing to talk about that we haven't talked about, we discussed a lot about Meir Poppers, is that what was his opinion for others disseminating and copying and editing the Toras HaAriZal, notably Rabbi Saruk, and others? He would travel around. He was in Italy a lot. What was where did he feel like he was in that place versus others?
I think that he viewed himself as somebody who had made this journey, right? This huge journey from Krakow to Jerusalem, and acquired all of this knowledge and all of these texts, right? Both mastering as, a student of Kabbalat Ari, mastering the body of knowledge that it is and practice, and also somebody who had collected all of the available texts and edited them together in the most responsible way. And so he viewed himself sort of as the representative of the Eretz Yisraeli, Jerusalem, Damascus, Egypt, that region, Sephardi in many ways, the Sephardi tradition of studying Kabbalat Ari. I don't know whether he thought that Rabbi Yisrael Saruk was a student of the Ari. I'll say a word about who that was. Rabbi Yisrael Saruk is a character who we don't know that much about, who shows up in the 16 teens in various towns in the Balkans, in Italy, even in Krakow, and represents himself as a student of the Ari and starts to teach the teachings of the Ari. And the way he presents it is somewhat different than it appears in the writings of Rav Chaim Vital and Yosef ibn Tabul, such that there are those like Gershom Sholem who claimed that he was not really a student of the Ari. There are traditional Mekubalim, particularly Sephardi Mekubalim, who say his works should not be studied because they're not authoritative, whereas Rav Chaim Vital's writings are. However, he was extremely popular and very basic in the Ashkenazi tradition through Italy. So he teaches Rabbi Menachem Azaria of Fano, Ramami Fano. For the record, everybody says Ramami Pano, and Pano is not a real place. Fano is a town in Italy, where he was from.
It's like when people say Sipornu, but continue.
Yeah. The writings of Saruk become very important because they're also published very early on. First by Yashar Mikandia, Yosef Shlomo del Medigo publishes them his student rather publishes them in the 1620s, and then they're published in 1648 again by Rabbi Naftali Bachrach in the famous Emek HaMelech, a book of Kabbalah which aroused a lot of opposition because it published too much. Right, so there are many people who wrote against it as sort of too out in the open with all these traditions. And, Rav Meir Poppers is aware of that. He doesn't want to publish his books in print. He wants to publish his books in manuscript. Why does he want to publish his books in manuscript? Because the circulation of a textbook in print is a commercial relationship. This is here my theorizing. When you print a book, you sell a book because there's a massive outlay of money in order to publish a whole edition. And so there's a drive to get as many people as possible to buy as many copies of a book that you publish. When you copy a book by hand, that is an intimate relationship which takes a long time. And for example, imagine you're Meir Poppers arriving in Krakow. You have one book, and you can choose and vet and really monitor every single person who copies that book. That is a way of controlled publication that is perfectly suited for Kabbalah, because it's not that they want to hide it from everybody. That's a waste, right? They believe the new form of Kabbalah of the Ari. It's the deepest secrets of the universe. They want people to learn it, but they don't want everybody to learn it. And so for Meir Poppers, the way to control access while allowing some access and some circulation is to keep things in manuscript and to have them be copied in a controlled way.
So I think that's what we have on Meir Poppers. I think really a fascinating story, life story, and as far as a really important and influential figure, one that maybe probably a lot of listeners never heard of. So this is great that they get to hear of him and his writings. Right now, for reading, I know you're still working on your dissertation. So right now, there's, as I mentioned, in the Menagnozim Volume 14, there's that piece from Moshe Hillel. There's also I think it's in the Talar of Avat Shalom, and I mentioned this Art Tzadikim. That nice edition has a little bit of intro. So there's like things here or there, but that's really what there is, the reading.
Well, it goes without saying that,
Kabbalas Hari, the 3 volumes of Yosef Avivi, Ben Tzvi Institute. Yeah, there's
like 2 chapters on Rav Meir Poppers, and I want to say, without Avivi, we would not know our head from our feet, and that those treatments really lay the groundwork. Even Shalom wrote on him a little bit, actually, early on. So there's writings here and there about him. I'm hopeful that when my dissertation is done and eventually circulates, whether by hand or in print or digitally, it will be of interest to people, and it will be a sort of big picture placing Rabbi Meir Poppers in his different contexts and the way that this knowledge grew with him as he moved through his life and through both Poland, the Ottoman Empire, Eretz Yisrael, all these things.
And I want to thank the anonymous sponsor again for this episode, and I want to say to the listeners that that's not the only way to get an episode recorded on Svarim Chatter, but it's something that I forgot about, and if someone heard something like that and they're like, well, I want you to do a certain episode with such a guest, and maybe you mentioned it, or maybe I have this idea, and here I'm willing to sponsor the episode, so sometimes that can work, and it's in this case, and I do appreciate that in this instance, and so... and also, I see that there's interest in it. People saying, I want to sponsor this episode. I want you to do this episode on Rabbi Meir Poppers. And, I know there's more of an interest in Kabbalah, and I haven't done enough of that. So this is an opportunity to do so. And I hope the listeners enjoyed and were enlightened by this episode. And thank you, Avinoam, for coming on the podcast once again.
I want to say thank you to Nachi also for welcoming me into the home studio, which is a really holy space, Mikdash Ma'at here. And just to thank you for everything you do, because these podcasts for me, and I'm sure for other people as well, is really a lifeline connection to all of our beautiful traditions and scholars. And it's a pleasure to be part of the Chatter story.
Thank you. I appreciate the kind words. And yes, nice to meet you in person in Lakewood. And don't get to do enough of these in person. You're in Berlin. A lot of guests now, I do it via Riverside. We got to do it wherever the guests are, but it's nice every once in a while to do it in person. And of course, the audio quality for the listeners, I'm sure they get to enjoy that as well. So thank you, Avinoam, for joining me once again.